The human ship drifted at the edge of the ruined system, its hull scarred by old battles and quiet years. Owen Hale was the last human assigned to deep recovery, a scavenger of forgotten wars and dead civilizations. When his scanners lit up with a weak distress signal, he almost ignored it, because hope had a habit of getting people killed. The signal came from a shattered orbital habitat, torn open like a wound against the stars. As he docked, the silence pressed against him, heavy and accusing. Inside the habitat, he found signs of evacuation, scorch marks, clawed walls, and empty escape pods. Then he heard voices, soft and trembling, echoing through the metal corridors. 5 alien girls stood together in the emergency bay, their skin glowing faintly in conquests he had no name for. They were young by their species standards, survivors hiding where the universe had forgotten them. One stepped forward, her eyes wide and shining with fear and resolve. She spoke in broken trade language, her voice shaking as she said, "Save me, take me with you." Behind her, the others clutched each other, hope flickering like a fragile flame. Owen felt the old weight settle in his chest, the weight of choice. They told him what had happened as they shared the last of their ration crystals. Their world had been labeled expendable during a border purge, erased to make room for a stronger empire. The station had been a school, then a shelter, then a tomb for everyone except them. They survived by hiding, by staying quiet while soldiers marched past and death echoed through the halls. Each girl carried loss in a different way, a mother, a sister, an entire sky burned away. The one who had spoken first was named Lyra, and she had been trained to negotiate, not to beg. Yet here she was, pleading with a stranger from a species rumorud to be extinct. They knew humans were dangerous, relentless, and stubborn beyond reason. They also knew humans were the only ones who might not turn them away. Owen listened without interrupting, his jaw tight, his hands clenched. He remembered Earth, remembered how the stars had watched as humanity burned. In their faces, he saw echoes of his own past. Taking them aboard would mean breaking protocols that no longer truly mattered. It would mean risking pursuit, risking his mission, risking his life. The galaxy did not reward kindness, it exploited it. Lyra met his eyes again and repeated the words, "Save us, take us with you." Something inside Owen finally broke, not loudly, but completely. He opened the ship and ushered them inside, sealing the hatch behind them. The girls stepped onto human metal with reverence, as if crossing into legend. For the first time since the war, the ship felt less empty. Owen set a course away from the system, engines humming like a promise. As stars stretched into light, the girls watched in silent awe. They were leaving death behind, even if they did not know what awaited them ahead. Freedom was brief, as it often was. An Imperial patrol ship emerged from hyperspace, weapons hot and hungry. The girls panicked, their fear filling the cockpit like smoke. Owen pushed the ship hard, rerouting power, flying with instinct more than calculation. He broadcast an old human code, a warning once feared across the stars. The patrol hesitated, long enough for Owen to slip into an asteroid field. Explosions lit the darkness as stone and fire danced around them. Lyra held onto her friends, whispering prayers in a language older than the war. When silence returned, the patrol was gone, unwilling to chase a human into chaos. Owen exhaled slowly, realizing his hands were shaking. The girls stared at him with something new in their eyes, not just hope, but trust. They traveled together after that, not as cargo, but as companions. The girls learned human stories of Earth, oceans, and stubborn dreams. Owen learned their songs, melodies meant to be sung under living skies. They found refuge on a fringe world that welcomed survivors and ghosts alike. As they stepped onto soil warmed by a gentle sun, Lyra smiled for the first time. She thanked him not as a sovereign, but as someone who chose to care. Oven realized he was no longer alone in the universe. Humanity might be broken, but it was not finished. As long as someone could say, "Save me," and another could answer, "Come with me," the stars would still have a future worth reaching for. The refuge world was called Capri by those who still bothered to name planets, a place balanced on the edge of forgotten trade routes and ignored by empires too busy devouring brighter stars. Its skies were amber at dawn and violet at night, kulkas that reminded Oven of sunsets he barely remembered from Earth. The settlement was small, built from salvaged hulls and alien stone, a patchwork of survivors who trusted no flag but tolerated one another. For the 5 girls, the ground itself felt unreal beneath their feet, solid proof that survival was not just a temporary delay before death. Lyra knelt and pressed her palm to the soil, closing her eyes as if listening to something only she could hear. She said her people believed planets remembered footsteps, that the land itself could choose whether to welcome you. Oven watched quietly, realizing how much culture could be erased, and yet still survive in gestures and whispers. The other girls followed her example, touching the ground, breathing deeply, some laughing softly through tears they no longer tried to hide. For the first time since he had found them, none of them asked to stay close to the ship. The settlement council met them with suspicion masked as politeness, eyes lingering on Oven's human markings and the alien glow of the girl's skin. Humans were myths here, stories of extinction or monsters depending on who told them. Oven spoke little, letting the girls explain who they were and what they needed. They asked for shelter, work, and anonymity, not protection, not pity. The council debated in low voices, calculating risk the way survivors always did. In the end, practicality won over fear, as it usually did on worlds like this. The girls were granted provisional residence, and Oven was offered fuel and supplies in exchange for occasional transport runs. No one called it charity, because charity was a luxury few could afford. Days turned into weeks, and the girls began to change in small but unmistakable ways. Fear loosened its grip on their movements, shoulders straightened, voices grew steadier. They learned the rhythms of the settlement, when markets opened, when guards changed shifts, where to find quiet places to think. Lyra took work as a translator, her talent with languages proving invaluable among the fractured species of Capri. 2 of the others apprenticed with engineers, their delicate hands perfect for precision work. The youngest stayed close to Oven at first, following him like a shadow until she felt brave enough to wander on her own. At night they gathered in the small quarters they shared, telling stories of what they had lost and what they might build. Evan often listened from the doorway, not intruding, just grounding himself in the sound of life continuing. Yet the galaxy was never content to leave survivors alone. Rumors reached Capri of renewed imperial expansion, of systems pacified and populations relocated or erased. Old human codes began to circulate again on black channels, warnings and signals that should not have existed. Evan recognized them immediately, fragments of a resistance humanity was never supposed to rebuild. He pretended not to notice at first, because noticing meant choosing. But Lyra noticed his tension, the way his eyes tracked every incoming ship, every unfamiliar broadcast. One evening, she confronted him gently, asking what ghosts followed him across the stars. He told her the truth, that humans were scattered, hunted, and angry, and that some of them were beginning to remember who they used to be. The girls listened in silence, understanding more than he expected. They knew what it meant to be declared inconvenient, to be erased for the sake of order. Lyra said her people once believed that when a species survived its extinction, it carried a responsibility. Not revenge, but memory. Memory, she explained, was the most dangerous weapon of all. Evan thought of Earth, of oceans boiling and cities burning, of the galaxy watching and moving on. He wondered if humanity's survival was an accident or an obligation it had not yet fulfilled. The choice remembered him before he could make it. A damaged freighter arrived one night, broadcasting a human distress signal layered beneath civilian noise. Evan answered without hesitation, getting the ship down to a hidden landing zone. The crew was human, thin, scarred, and exhausted, their eyes carrying the same weight he saw in his own reflection. They spoke of enclaves forming, of whispered alliances between species the Empire had wronged. They spoke of a coming conflict that would not be a war of territory, but of consequence. The girls listened from the edge of the clearing, fear and determination warring across their faces. When the humans asked Evan to join them, to use his ship and his experience, he did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the 5 girls who had once begged him to save them. They had found safety here, fragile but real, something he could not easily justify risking. Lyra met his gaze and did not look away. She said they had not asked to be taken away from death just to hide, while others faced it alone. She said survival that cost others their future was just another kind of extinction. The others nodded, voices joining hers, soft but unyielding. They were afraid, but they were not willing to be silent anymore. Preparations began quietly because loud hope attracted enemies. Evan refitted his ship, upgrading shields, expanding quarters, installing systems humanity had learned to build the hard way. The girls trained as well, learning navigation, defense protocols, and the brutal mathematics of survival. They were not soldiers, and no one tried to make them into that. Instead, they became something else, witnesses, messengers, and proof that the Empire's erasures were failing. When they left Kepri, the settlement watched in silence, knowing better than to say goodbyes that might never be answered. The stars felt different this time, heavier, as if aware of the direction the ship was traveling. They visited broken worlds, hidden stations, and drifting communities that existed only because someone refused to surrender. Everywhere they went, the girls told their story not with anger but with clarity. They spoke of schools turned into shelters, of soldiers who followed orders too well, of survival bought with silence. And everywhere, species listened, because the story was not unfamiliar, only newly voiced. Imperial forces began to take notice, not because of attacks, but because of unrest. Populations questioned relocations, administrators hesitated, soldiers delayed. The Empire had never feared rebellion as much as it feared memory spreading faster than control. Evan's ship became a moving symbol, a rumor, a human vessel carrying survivors who refused to disappear. They were chased, ambushed, and nearly destroyed more than once. Each time, they escaped not through superior firepower, but through allies who chose to help. Worlds that had once watched humanity burn now closed their ports to Imperial ships, just long enough. In the quiet moments between jumps, Evan watched the girls grow into themselves. Lyra no longer spoke in broken phrases, her voice steady and commanding when needed. The others laughed more, argued more, dreamed out loud without immediately apologizing for it. They were no longer just survivors, they were participants. One night, as the ship drifted between stars, Lyra asked Evan if he regretted taking them with him. He answered honestly, saying regret had stopped being useful a long time ago. What he felt instead was purpose, something he had not expected to find again. The galaxy did not change overnight, because galaxies never do. But small shifts accumulated, like pressure along a fault line. Empires rely on the belief that resistance is isolated, temporary, and doomed. Evan and the 5 girls existed as living contradictions to that belief. They were proof that extinction could fail, that mercy could survive, that memory could spread. And somewhere, far from the routes they traveled, others listened and prepared. In time, stories would be told about a lone human ship and 5 alien girls who asked not to be saved, but to be taken along. Some would call them symbols, others would call them trouble. But among the stars, where fear had once ruled uncontested, a different message now traveled quietly. That when someone said, "Save me," and another answered, "Come with me," the universe itself shifted just a little, and that was sometimes enough. The ship no longer felt like a vessel running from the past, but one moving deliberately towards something unfinished. The routes they traveled were no longer random, but shaped by quiet invitations and carefully hidden signals. Each jump carried them closer to systems where tension trembled just beneath the surface of obedience. Evan sensed it in the way ports delayed imperial inspections, in the way locals avoided eye contact but listened closely. The girls had learned how to read these moments, how to speak when silence would be mistaken for fear. Lyra addressed crowds without stages or banners, choosing markets, docks, and communal halls instead. She spoke calmly, naming losses without embellishment, describing survival without apology. People leaned in, not because she demanded attention, but because she carried truth without desperation. Evan stood nearby during these gatherings, not as a protector, but as a witness. He understood now that his role was not to lead, but to endure. Humans had always been good at enduring long enough for others to decide what kind of future they wanted. That was how they had survived extinction, not through dominance, but through refusal. Imperial pressure increased, patrols tightening, warnings growing sharper. Yet the response was uneven, almost hesitant. Some ships followed orders rigidly, others delayed just long enough to miss their chance. The Empire was learning what humanity had once known too late, that obedience cracked when too many people remembered why they were afraid. One evening, as the ship rested in the shadow of a gas giant, the youngest girl asked Oven what would happen when this ended. He told her the truth, that endings were rarely clean and often mistaken for beginnings. He said that even if the Empire fell, something else would rise, because power always did. What mattered was whether memory survived long enough to shape what came next. The girls talked late into the cycle, imagining schools that never became shelters, worlds that never needed hiding places. They spoke of teaching history before fear, of alliances built from shared survival instead of shared enemies. Their dreams were not loud, but they were persistent, and persistence had always frightened tyrants more than weapons. When the ship jumped again, Oven felt the familiar pull in his chest, the reminder that movement itself was an act of defiance. The stars stretched and reformed, ancient and indifferent, yet quietly altered by those who passed through them. Somewhere behind them, someone would repeat a story they had heard. Somewhere ahead, someone would be waiting for proof that survival was not the same as surrender. Oven looked at the 5 girls, no longer pleading, no longer hiding. They had not asked to be heroes, only to be carried forward. And as long as the ship kept moving, as long as someone chose to answer when another whispered, "Save me," the stars would remember.